guys. I'm Jessica.
And I'm Judith.
Today we are going to be talking about sex tourism and human trafficking in Thailand.
Mhm. So, I guess first we can start off by explaining why we chose this topic. We've had assumptions, and we didn't really know much about what does sex tourism mean, and we wanted to find out a little bit more about its association or relationship with human trafficking and the sex industry, and in particular how it affects people, how it affects Thailand, but also certain like the workers. So certain populations were of interest, but yeah, and one of the reasons how this came to be was actually because Jessica brought it up, and you can tell them more
Yes,
about that.
I got the opportunity to go to Thailand a couple of years ago, actually about 2 years ago. And I went out with a couple of my friends. We went to this area similar to the Strip, so there's a bunch of bars, clubs. There's a lot of stuff going on. But most importantly, there were women on display, and there were just individuals on display, and there were prices too, and there were promoters. Hey, come to my club. As women, since I was in a group with women, that we weren't really approached. Um, the promoters were targeting mostly men
Mm.
who were there, the tourists that were there. Women, we just kind of almost didn't exist. Uh, but it was something else happened while we were walking around and while we went to clubs. Men were they were one, very aggressive. Two, they were very overbearing and very inappropriate with the women that they were talking to. Most of the women were Thai women. They would go and touch her genitals, and it was just this. I kept on seeing this constantly. So it wasn't just this one incident where I saw this couple. No, it was a group of guys trying to see what was under their pants. And one of the reasons why they were doing that, it was to see whether they were women or if they were transgender women. And but either way, it's still very invasive. And one of the articles talked about that type of behavior. Those men, they're usually from Europe, Australia, America, and some other countries, but they don't behave that way in their countries. But they feel that freedom when they go to Thailand, and they feel very like it's almost their right, or they're there for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, in another article, I also mentioned that the European Union tried to do investigation on how a lot of European citizens are going to Thailand specifically for the sex tourism, even though they know that human trafficking is an international crime and prostitution is illegal in Thailand. That almost seems to it almost seems like there's this illusion that their responsibility is non-existent there to follow the law. There's like this disassociation, and Thailand's sort of the exception to the rule. And in another article, I did mention how 60% of the tourists coming to Thailand were men, and out of that population, 70% of them reported they were specifically there for the sex tourism. So it's really interesting because you start to see a lot of like the stratification, a lot of the components. Well, actually, yeah, a lot more of the components to how it came to be to where Thailand is considered one of the hot spots for human trafficking, how it has prevailed, even with attempts from the government trying to just minimize and decrease and combat human trafficking. So it's definitely interesting how they have continued to have issues with this. So I'm not sure if you found anything similar also in your studies.
Yes, when it comes to sex workers, they talked about Phuket a little bit, and they said that there's about 7,000 women involved in sex work, and that's a very conservative number because those numbers usually only include people who are over 18 and people who work inside of an establishment. It could be a nightclub, it could be a karaoke bar, or it could just be a massage parlor. But it does not account for people being trafficked.
Mm-hmm.
It does not account for minors, and also those numbers they do not take account men.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this before or not, but Phuket and Bangkok and Pattaya are like they're just generally known for being hotspots, and they're um, a lot of there's a lot of migration. A lot of the people that go there are typically reported to be from more impoverished areas. So poverty is actually one of the main reasons why human trafficking can be more likely in certain areas, particularly in Thailand. Human traffickers look for the opportunity, specifically in certain areas where they know like villages are impoverished. Well, that's where they go and typically recruit. They will deceive a lot of the people, and they will say, "Hey, how about you go and we'll get you a job here. It'll be something stable, so you and your family can survive." Um, and you can make a significant more amount of money as comparing to if you work in the fields. On average, you can make about $78 a month. Um, but also, there's so many more variables as well. Poverty can be one of them. Migration is definitely where people are at risk when they move to a new place. Well, they're more likely to be away from supports. They're more likely to not know what's going on, and that's when traffickers really try and then pretty much implement their own agenda. And a lot of the articles talked about pretty much the interviews and the people, typically the female sex workers that they worked with, how they gave their own stories of how also the families, so civilians would play an important role in this because the families, um, some of them would know what that they were getting into the sex industry, or they were possibly being forced into getting into the sex industry. A few of the articles mention how education was also a big component in it because a few of the people interviewed, a few of the female workers who were victims of human trafficking and were able to get out of it, gave their story on how they did have a chance to pursue a higher education, but they couldn't because of financial instability. And even when they were trafficked and they left that situation. In one instance, Palm, which was one of the female sex workers interviewed, she was able to escape and essentially just not escape, actually buy her way out, work for years, and then eventually when she came back to her family, the traffickers came back and they offered her a position as a sex work supervisor, so she would supervise other women. She denied it because it was something obviously she didn't want to be in anymore, but her family actually ended up shunning her and kicking her out of the home, which left her pretty much with no resources or support. There's even this morality component to it as well. And I think in one of your articles it mentions how it's almost like a contradiction, but there's a morality component.
It is a contradiction because I watched one documentary and it was the owner or the manager of a club, and in the sex club, of course, they have sex workers there, but he said that sex workers are important to Thailand or important to men because if they didn't have them, they would be out in the streets raping women. So it's necessary to have prostitutes, but it's illegal. And it's illegal, but it's very interesting. It's illegal, but the government makes a lot of money out of it. it makes it between 2% to 10%. The 2% is a very modest number. Most likely, it's going to be 10%, and that contributes to the total GDP of the country. Those numbers, and there's also you have about $300 million being sent out from the main cities out to rural areas yearly. So that's a lot of money being just kind of exploited or just being made in general when it comes to tourism or sex tourism.
Again, we found a lot of components of why human trafficking continues to be a persistent issue. We mentioned that it was poverty. We mentioned education is a big thing. Laws and legislature as well.
Religion, religion plays a big. It's a big component of Thailand's culture. Women, even Kathois, they make money to send out to their parents or their families, or it's just to be able to survive. But they also donate, and they donate money to monks because they believe that if they do so, they will have a better life in the next life. They would have more opportunities in the next life. They also believe that them being sex workers is part of their fate, because most likely they did something in another life that they're paying for now. There was one particular individual that was interviewed. She is a transgender woman and sees both things as faith. She sees being a Catholic as part of her faith because of just another life, and this is what's happening to her. And then also having to be a sex worker as part of her faith.
Yeah, going off of what you said, I actually did find an article that talked a little bit about reality tourism, where a lot of places that in Thailand that give reality tourism, which is kind of a campaign to invoke awareness to the public of the reality, then painting the real picture of human trafficking. It's actually somewhat biased, and a lot of the organizations that tend to collaborate with showing reality tourism and projecting that and campaigning for that happen to be faith-based. So there's that morality bias, that component to it. And in the research, it showed that a lot of the people that were, a lot of the tourists actually that went in through the reality tourism experience, they ended up leaving thinking that all form of sex work was human trafficking.
We did want to talk, well, both of us did find additional research that not only talks about human trafficking, but it also talks about the health implications. The article that I found was, as I mentioned before, the Kathoy. The Kathoy is widely known as their ladyboys, is transgender women, and it is part of their culture, but still they're stigmatized. So they don't have a lot of opportunity or upper mobility. They can be beauticians, performers, or sex workers. They don't have a lot of options when it comes to work. And they do find themselves, a lot of them, they do find themselves becoming sex workers. And there are two types. The ones that will work for an establishment, and the ones that will work for themselves. The ones that do work for themselves run higher risk of contracting HIV because based on some of the interviews and the research, once they go to a hotel, that's it. They're not able to say no to a client. They're not able to say no to the things that they're asked to perform. Or even if they're able to, now they're forced to perform things that they don't want to. And that's what essentially increases their likelihood of contracting any STDs.
In the article we read, there was one where they found that trafficked female sex workers compared to sex workers that were considered not trafficked, they were at 3 times higher risk of basically becoming pregnant and just as likely to have an abortion, which inferred that the abortion was unwanted or the pregnancy was unwanted or forced. And similarly as well, a lot of the times a lot of the workers, traffic sex workers, reported would they would be migrated, so they would move from place to place, uh, not only to avoid the police, but also for the traffickers to kind of have that more control of, I'm going to place you somewhere that way you're less likely to know about resources and supports, and you're less likely to try and seek for help. Unfortunately, this means there's always a barrier between them having access to appropriate and adequate health care. And as a result, in the research, it showed that a little bit more than 2/3 of them, of the trafficked female sex workers, and they had never had any tests for STDs or STIs. So that kind of tends to highlight a little bit of possibly why HIV, the HIV numbers are very disproportionate in Thailand. They are actually having they're having a big issue with that as well. So that tends to also correlate and can be associated with the human trafficking aspect and component of it. And with Thailand, they're really the government has tried to invoke some strategies, but the research and the articles really try to hopefully have Thailand, and they identify that Thailand hopefully should work towards an education reform, but also they should work towards following through with the laws, if not improving the current laws and prosecution cases towards the traffickers, not the victims. And that's also what the research showed, that they wanted to not criminalize the victims, because then it would be a contradiction. They're seen as victims, but yet they're punished as well.
I don't know if you mentioned it already, but
Mhm.
what was the number that you had said? How many cases did go through?
Oh yeah, out of it was a recent report where out of 300 investigated trafficking cases in Thailand, only 10 were successfully resulted in convictions, and went through the prosecution and everything. Only 10 out of 305, I believe. So it's that's a pretty astounding number. So that's definitely something that one of the articles also showed that corruption is definitely a big thing. The bribing
Yes.
of officials, and because there's so much profit in this.
It is illegal.
Yeah.
Remember this.
Yeah.
It is illegal, but it contributes to
The
approximately
economy,
10% of Thailand's GDP. And this is just sex tourism. This is not tourism in general. This is just sex tourism.
Which is why a lot of the authors kind of seek towards the legislature side of, hey, the laws probably need reforming, or if not more following through of especially cracking down on the corruption, and also providing its citizens and its victims with appropriate resources, more supports, and definitely an education reform, and livable wages, especially to the areas that are very impoverished. So
livable wages, but also a possible shift when it comes to religious beliefs and gender roles.
Yeah, a lot of a lot of awareness and knowledge of what this really means and what's behind it too. There's definitely a lot, and it's hard to combat political and moral agendas, but I think the more people become aware of it, the more they start seeing the bigger picture of things, especially in relation to sex tourism and human trafficking in Thailand. So
yes.
Sure.
And we will add some agencies that are helping combat sex tourism and sex trafficking in Thailand at the end of the credits.
Yep.
All right, guys.
All right. Thanks for
Thank
listening.
you.
Bye. Bye.